Hi everybody, my name is Diane Mulligan and I am an artist, teacher, and writer from Central Massachusetts. In this video, I am going to show you a quick demo of how I painted this little study of a California tree poppy using only transparent watercolor. So before we dive into the demo, a couple of things to think about here. When we are painting in watercolor and we want something to be white, we have to preserve the white of the page. And so it might seem kind of funny to paint a white flower using watercolor. That means, in fact, we're going to be leaving a fair amount of space unpainted. And that's true. But in order for our flower to have dimension, it needs to have shadows. And what we really want to think about when we're painting white is leaving the white of the page, but also, and more importantly, how do we want to create shadows that are lively and interesting? In the photo reference, which you see here, the shadows look somewhat gray and a little bit flat. But in real life, those shadows have a lot of vibrancy and dimension. One of the things about quick photographs like this, which I just snapped with my phone, is that they compress the color information, and unless you're a really skilled photographer and using good photography equipment, you're not really getting all of the depth and interest that you get in real life. And this is one of the reasons I paint. I'm not a good photographer. I want to convey what I see and feel with paint in a way that I can't do with a photograph. So when I'm looking at this, I'm seeing two types of shadows. I'm seeing the form shadow, and that's the shadow that shows us where the petals of the flower are not in full sunlight. They are angled and tipped away from the sunlight, and those shadows reveal to us the shape and dimension and interest of those petals. And I'm also seeing cast shadows. So cast shadows are the shadow that one object create on another object, and cast shadows tend to be fairly hard-edged and precise, and they will also reveal the form of the surface they're falling on, but they tend to have maybe a harder edge than a form shadow will. So we have two kinds of shadows to deal with, and we could paint them with a gray paint such as Payne's Gray, Neutral Tint, Jane's Gray. These are all perfectly acceptable approaches, but to me, those tube colors don't convey the liveliness of the scene. This flower in real life, it's waving in the wind and it's catching the light. It's very dynamic, and the shadows didn't feel gray. They felt blue and purple, and sometimes they have other colors bouncing around in them in a way that really catches the eye and makes them shimmer. So what we're going to do today is mix a shadow color, and we're going to do this entire painting using just a primary color triad. The colors I will be using are Ultramarine, Cadmium Red Medium, and Hansa Yellow Medium. And this is a very warm primary triad that's going to help me convey this beautiful summer flower in the bright, bright sunshine. So let's go to the demo and see how this works. For the playback here, I have sped this up a little bit. In real time, this study took about 20 minutes, not counting drying time. So here you can see I am mixing up some of my cadmium red and ultramarine, and that cadmium red is fierce. A tiny bit goes a long way. What I want is a nice purple that I can use as the starting point of my shadows. So I'm testing out my color on some scrap. Dry my brush off. I want a very wet, light mix of pigment, but I don't want my brush to be sopping. And I'm going to begin, you can see I have a very faint line drawing here, and I'm just looking carefully at my reference and beginning to place the shadow shapes. And I'm giving them a sort of ragged edge because that is how they look. This is a sort of crenellated flower, and the shadows are not smooth surfaces. And I'm just carefully following the shape of the flower and trying to put the shadow shapes that I see. as I move across the flower, I'm going to be constantly varying back and forth the precise mix of pigment. So I'm going to sometimes add a little more blue, sometimes a little bit more red, because that creates a lot of interest in the painting. And if I just made one smooth, flat shadow color, I wouldn't get the sense of movement that we could see in the reference. So I'm going to go around the flower this way, just focusing on shadow shapes. I did keep my pencil drawing very faint here, so I know you can't necessarily see my pencil drawing quite clearly. And that's because this is a white flower and I don't want distracting pencil lines in my finished product. I have found that, oh, here you can see I'm putting in the cast shadow of this flower center, and when I flipped my paintbrush around here, what I have done with this paintbrush is, it's a wooden paintbrush, and I stuck it in my pencil sharpener and just sharpened the end of it into a point that I could use to scratch into paintings, or in this case, what I did was drag out those little lines of the filaments of the center of that flower. I used the edge of the brush in the wet paint and just dragged those out for a little fringy texture. It's a fun trick. Okay, so as you can see here, continuing around my flower, and as I was saying, for me, anytime one of my paintings goes wrong, it's a failure of looking. If I stop looking closely at my reference, I start painting what I think instead of what I see. And at that point, that usually becomes something in my painting that reads as false. So I cannot stress enough the importance of just looking, always looking closely. As you can see here, I'm coming to the end of my shadows. And so now we need to let this dry. While the petals are drying, I am painting these pretty little buds, and I have mixed my green from my Hansa yellow and my ultramarine. If you don't have Hansa yellow, I think cadmium yellow is a very similar color. Just use a nice bright warm yellow with your blue. So painting these in, keeping this pretty light right now, we'll add shadows onto them later, but they are very yellow in the reference, so I'm keeping with that. Now that the petal has dried, I'm adding the center of the flower with a really nice bright mix of my yellow. And I am creating some texture in there. It does seem like a very textured center of a flower. I'm sorry, I don't know the botanical names. I'm not a botanical illustrator. So I'm keeping a bit of texture. And I also want to use my smallest little rigger brush to touch in a very little bit of red around the edge of my flower, because there is this kind of orangey, vibrant edge. So I'm really lightly touching that in. I'm using a fairly thick consistency of paint and my brush is quite dry. So even though I'm dropping it into wet paint, it's not going to go super far. It's not going to spread like crazy, but it will get a diffused edge. The center of the flower here is definitely really important to capturing the feel of it, so I want to get that right. And you can see, you just saw there, I had my tester paper out because there's also some reflection of that yellow in the white of the paper. And I'm using a very, very watery mix here to just touch in onto the dry page where that yellow shows up. Now that we have all of the base layer of our flower in, we've got a good start, but it does still look flat. So what I'm looking at now are, where are the shadows on the flower darkest? And I'm using a more blue mix. It's a very similar consistency of paint and pigment from my first layer, but it's a bit more blue, and I'm going to glaze this in gently on the areas where the shadow is darkest. And a lot of those are actually the cast shadows of the other petals or the fold of the flower. I also am going to have to add dimension to those buds and to the center of my flower. So this is the stage that we're at. You can see I'm just deepening the flower around that raised center, deepening the shadow, because I want this flower to feel dynamic. layering the paint like this, right, as long as I am gentle, it's not really going to reactivate the layer underneath, so I'm not too worried about that. For the center of the flower, I have created a nice dark purple. It's a very thick consistency of paint, and I'm using a teeny tiny brush to create that little ring around the center. And now I'm creating more of an orange to just add some more texture and interest into that center, where it really is lots and lots of tiny little fibers that you can see in the reference. It's a lot of fun to add these details and do a little of, what we call calligraphy on there, where I'm making these tiny little shapes and motions. And as I have already said, I am not a botanical illustrator. I'm not trying for photorealism, but I absolutely love painting flowers. They're just beautiful and they cheer me up. So I'm trying to bring a little expressive touch to it and not worried about being, perfectly faithful. So now, using the colors I already have on my pigment, because on my palette rather, I'm only using 3 paints today. I'm deepening the green to add some dimension to our buds and trying to keep the vibrancy but also give them a little bit of depth and interest. We're really coming to the end stages of what we're going to do on this flower, so these details really matter to bring the painting out. That said, you can see this still doesn't look fully dimensional yet, and that's because we don't have much to contrast with the white of the flower, but that will all change in our next step. And while I've sped this playback up, really take your time on this step. It looks very fast thanks to the magic of video editing, but these are slow and deliberate strokes that I'm laying down, and just because it's going fast on the video, don't expect yourself to be so quick. Once everything on the flower and the buds is completely dry, it's time to really make this flower show up. And we're going to do that with some negative painting. That is, I'm going to paint around the existing shapes with a very dark, thick, creamy mix of paint. I'm starting with a dark blue-green and just mixing that from my ultramarine and yellow, and very carefully painting around the flower and buds. But by putting this really dark, strong background, that flower is going to leap forward at us the same way it does in life. If you are not as confident painting around edges like this, you certainly could do your drawing, use masking fluid to cover all the flower and buds, and you could do a dark background first. That's a completely valid approach here. You could even paint the flower, let it dry completely, and use masking fluid on top. I don't ever do that, but you could. But I tend to use masking fluid very rarely because I am mostly working from life on location, and masking fluid is just not convenient for painting outdoors, right? If I, in an ideal world, I wouldn't be painting this at my desk. I would be standing in a beautiful garden, and masking fluid just doesn't fit into my traveling setup. So for me, I would rather paint the flower and then come back in around it. You can see here in my mix, I've added in some red to just I'm trying to vary that background color all the while as I come forward. The only real trick about painting in this way, where I bring the background in after, is always working from a wet edge. So you may have noticed in this, I'm going back and forth on which side of the paper I'm working on. I'm not just doing one side to the other. And the reason I'm going back and forth is I'm working really hard to make sure that I'm only touching wet paint to wet paint. Because if I let an edge dry, I'm going to get really hard lines, and I don't want hard lines. I'm just doing a sort of suggestive dark, green garden background, and I'm not worried about the shapes in the background, right? This is just a study to demonstrate the flower, so I don't want any hard lines to appear. Okay, my painting has completely dried. I'm gonna pull off the tape for the big reveal. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you would like to learn techniques like this from me in real time with no sped up camera tricks and to get, to have personal conversations and feedback from me, please check out the class schedule at Two Bridges Art Academy, where I teach watercolor fundamentals. Have a great day, everyone, and happy painting!